So just getting my bearings. Bear with me. Okay. So yeah, I plan to have a little presentation. However, the internet doesn't appear to be working, so I'll just kind of go off of some notes that I have. So yeah, I'm representing Oregon Climate. Camilla is the main leader of that group, but she cannot be here tonight. She's up in Seattle, and she just asked me to make a presentation for her. So just a little background on Oregon Climate. So Oregon Climate is working to pass a climate policy that is fair, effective, and can be a model for the rest of the country to follow. So Oregon Climate supports putting a price on carbon and other emissions to hold polluters accountable and incentivize clean energy, and to distribute the revenue from those policies back to the residents of Oregon. So this model is known as a price and dividend, and it is a sure way to reduce emissions while supporting local economic development. And because it does not increase the size of government by giving revenue back to the taxpayers, it is recognized nationally as being a bipartisan solution to climate change. So currently, Oregon Climate has two bills in the 2015 legislature. The first one is HB 3176, and the second one is HB 3250. And so, let me just, yeah, so the HB 3716 is the cap and dividend, and the HB 3250 is the carbon fee and dividend. So basically, let's see. Yeah. So I'm just going to talk about the text of those two ordinances a little bit. So in the cap and dividend text, Section 2 talks about how the bill sets limits on greenhouse gas emissions, and how it will and how an auction-based market will minimize costs to emitters and also reimburse taxpayers. And it talks about how this bill will stimulate renewable tech industry in order to create energy. In order to create energy market distortions within Oregon. So it kind of just talks about that a little bit. Then it also talks. It states that emitters of greenhouse gases and it states that emitters purchase allowances at 1 metric ton sums of carbon dioxide equivalent, and so they purchase those allowances from the state, and so basically the government sets a cap and the price and does not determine the price of those allowances, and rather the market will respond to the amount of money or to the cap that the state sets, and the price of the allowances will end up being determined. So Section 4 talks about setting a path for achieving greenhouse gas levels that are 85% below 1990 levels by 2050, and it sets a basis for who is eligible for the auction market, and also requires the state to implement third-party verification services. Section 5 talks about how the Department of Revenue should conduct the auctions. Section 6 sets guidelines for redistributing money generated in the auctions to Oregon taxpayers. And finally, Section 7 establishes that the money generated in interest go back into the fund and ultimately go back to taxpayers. So now turning to the carbon fee and dividend, which is 3250. So Section 2 talks about how phasing in fees on greenhouse gas emissions will result in a thriving environment economy and will provide businesses with an incentive to increase energy efficiency. And also the money generated through the businesses, through that fee, will go back to taxpayers. Section 3 sets definitions for what fuel is and in what circumstances fuels are subject to a fee. Section 4 states that a fee is imposed on all fossil fuels and fossil fuel generated electricity at the equivalent rate of $30 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, and also that rate will increase by $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent per year, and also it will also adjust according to the cost of living. Section 5 talks about how vendors of electricity shall report carbon dioxide emissions to a commission, and also those reports will be subject to third-party overview. Section 6 sets guidelines for redistributing money from fees back to Oregon's taxpayers. And then finally, Section 7 just establishes that the money generated in interest go back into the fund. So, yeah, so Oregon Climate's 2 bills have been drafted with some core principles in mind. First, so the first principle is that it will establish price levels that will lead to emission reductions that adequately address the climate crisis, and according to most credible climatological and economic research, that is. So we need, and the second goal is that we need to ensure that lower income folks are not disproportionately affected by rising energy costs, and so that's where the dividend really comes into play, and since it's just one, it's one number, every taxpayer gets the same amount of dividend, that will it will benefit people with a lower income more than it does someone who has a much larger income. And finally, the policy that is put in place must be durable, and we can't pass a policy that will be vulnerable to repeal. Given the urgency of effective climate action, we don't have time to pass something that gets repealed, then comes back again in another form. We need something that is popular, particularly given that the policy to work, so particularly given the policy to work, energy and gas will have to get more expensive, and people need to see that the direct benefit, basically, that they're getting, and so those are the 3 main goals, and so. Yeah, and so now just to kind of turn to why these bills include the dividend type of a policy. So by returning the revenue from emission pricing back to Oregonians, which are going to be taxpayers and their dependents, the lowest income, 70% of Oregonians, will get more money back than they paid in increased energy costs. So this is fair and will protect lower income folks and from being negatively impacted by the price increase, which may result as a result of rising energy costs. And the dividend checks, as we've seen in Alaska, which also has a similar type of a program, will be widely popular and ensure that the policy will be lasting and not vulnerable to repeal. So, Yeah, so emissions pricing, so Oregon Climate's emission pricing policies target the vendors of fossil fuels, but also, with all of these types of policies, consumers should expect to have some of that cost handed down to them. And Oregon Climate supports a gradually increasing price, whether that be through a tax or a cap, on carbon dioxide equivalent to give consumers the equal, to give them all an opportunity to transition to cheaper and more efficient energy sources without significant financial impact. So yeah, so just to go back to the dividend again, so all the revenue generated from the carbon fee or carbon cap would be evenly distributed by mail once per year, and so distribution would be managed by existing state agencies, so the administration costs for that would be extremely minimal. And let's see, yeah, so the size of the dividend doesn't depend on one's, well, it doesn't depend on the amount of energy one consumes. Rather, the check that everyone receives is the same, even if someone doesn't consume any fossil fuels at all. And so therefore Oregonians would maximize their net return from the dividend by reducing fossil fuel consumption more and more. And so just a brief overview on these two different bills. So the cap and dividend, so it caps fossil fuels, requires energy companies to purchase pollution permits at auction, and returns all of the auction revenue in equal amounts to every Oregonian taxpayer. The fee and dividend. So this puts a fee on all fossil fuels and electricity at their first point of sale and inside the state at a rate of $30 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and has a scheduled and is scheduled to increase automatically at a rate of $10 per year. This is equivalent to an increase in gas prices of approximately 9 cents per year. And currently the fossil fuel industry doesn't pay the hidden costs, as we all know, for giving us these fossil fuels that we then pollute. So, but they really should be. And so, right now, as a result of that, we're paying for the natural disasters such as the floods, wildfires, and superstorms, and droughts, ocean acidification. And so a properly designed carbon tax would internalize all of these hidden costs, and the resulting price signal would encourage consumers to abate consumption and to give renewable alternatives an advantage over coal, gasoline, diesel, natural gas, and other fossil fuels. So with the regard to the cap versus tax issue, so Oregon Climate's proposing two bills. Both are price signal mechanisms. Both are cost effective. Both can be designed badly, and both can be designed well. So whether the policy determines the limit and the market determines the price, or the policy determines the price and the market determines the limit, it kind of, the part of the revenue neutrality also really plays a big part in, both of these bills. So if Oregon Climate had to go with one of these policies, it would be the tax because of the administrative simplicity and long-term predictability of energy prices, which really outweighs the benefit of specific emissions targets, which will almost certainly be reevaluated over the coming years. However, the cap and dividend does have a much higher chance of passing for a few reasons. So the cap and dividend really stands a much better chance in the Oregon legislature because it does not aim to tax fuels. Oregon's constitution puts very specific limits on the uses of a gas tax, and specifically all monies collected from a gas tax must go directly into the highway fund. And again, a permitting requirement does not count as a gas tax. Therefore, with the cap policy, the dividend is distributed back to all the taxpayers and not put into the interstate fund. Also, Oregon requires a supermajority to pass any revenue-raising measures, and our courts do not interpret the auction of permits from the cap and dividend policy to be a source of revenue. So therefore, wouldn't have to have a supermajority to pass. So Oregon's climate, in conclusion, is to ensure that the revenue neutrality price without fighting for a constitutional change. So the best plan for now is a cap. And yeah, that's it. So if you guys have any questions, I can definitely do my best to answer. Yeah.
Maybe what we should do is have everyone.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Bert, Sam. Sorry we didn't have the PowerPoint. Did a great job though, didn't you? So what I would like to do is invite you to ask questions to any of the individuals, Cheryl, Tom, Sam, or David, and all of us will try and answer your questions and help one another out. I'm sorry? Okay, I'll bring the microphone. I can see a question over here.
Yeah, would you guys like to come up the front? I can call on Jack if you want. You take this.
In the straw ballot we're looking at, the first three feature the word carbon. The last two, the word carbon is conspicuous by its absence. Is that significant?
I better do that one since I wrote the ballot.
Okay, you guys are off the hook on this one for a moment at least. Okay, question. The first three particularly mention carbon, and the last two, the word carbon isn't mentioned. When I started exploring these, I was very concerned that some of the bills simply talked about carbon, i.e. carbon dioxide, and did not address full greenhouse gas emissions and life cycle analyses. That is the case. That is a problem for me with 2082 and 2159. It turns out, I've been having conversations with Dan Golden, who's very much involved with the Oregon climate effort, and it turns out that their 3250 carbon fee and dividend bill is being amended to include the whole idea of full life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. I find that very encouraging. The other two, 3470 and 3176, both include full greenhouse gas life cycle analyses, and I think Tom will testify to that.
Thank you.
I don't need to, I mean, you said it. I also would, though, say that it's hard to do a straw ballot, in my opinion. Legislation should be written in plain English, and if you're really interested in one or more of these bills in terms of calling your legislator or saying, getting involved in it, they're very easily accessible on the state legislative website. If you remember the acronym OLIS, O-L-I-S, you can type Oregon OLIS, and it'll bring you up, then insert the number of the bill. You can get right to the text. You can see what the status of the hearings are, what the schedules are, et cetera, if any. And so OLIS is a source to get to the text, and I very much encourage people who are being involved and wanting to understand this particular, what we think is important legislation, to read it and let it speak for itself. Because a good bill will speak for itself. And we can come up and summarize and hit the high points, but I think good legislation should be comprehensible to at fourth grade level myself. Thank you.
Get Jeremiah. I'm not the...
I'm not sure I completely understand the impact of all these bills, but it seems like many of them are aimed at carbon or carbon products that are produced and or consumed in the state of Oregon. What about carbon that is transmitted through the state of Oregon? A pipeline of carbon.
I think in large measure the question, fossil fuel that shipped through the state, what do we do with that? Well, I think that gets a pass with all the bills.
That's because of federal interstate commerce regulations. We are not able to pass a bill in the state of Oregon which does something about things that are being passed through. We can pass laws in our own state that can control and regulate and fee and those sorts of things within the context of our own Constitution, as long as that's permissible. But in terms of a fuel truck passing through, to get from, if they're not refueling here, but if they're just going through, we can't touch it.
What about a liquefaction plant, for example, that emits?
Now, if you're talking about, for example, the
Jordan Cove, I think, is where.
exactly. If that's where you're going now, there's going to be a considerable emission impact from that plant itself, and they would fall under the laws and the regulations of Oregon. They're not passing through; they're actually manufacturing and producing and emitting, and those emission impacts are directly covered by most of these bills.
What about leakage from that pipeline?
Exactly. Under the terms of this life cycle analysis type of concept, leakage is included, the fugitive emissions. If fracking comes to pass in the state of Oregon, the leakage from that should be wrapped into this language. That's the way we intended it. I expect that would be the case, yes. Elderly first.
Pardon me, in both the bills that are being proposed in Oregon and perhaps in the existing CAT bill in California, what penalties are built into those laws for producers who decide it's cheaper just to ignore it than to buy the permits?
In California, there's explicit penalties, and they can be shut down, or they pay penalties to get back into the program. It is a regulatory scheme that they're very serious about. The California Air Resources Board is the administrative body. They have an excellent board. It's very impressive. One thing I forgot to mention about California is that they passed it by legislation in 2006. The California Department, the Chamber of Commerce, California Chamber of Commerce, brought it to the voters to repeal it in 2010. The voters supported it by a 24% margin. The CARB board is really on track with this. They are very serious about regulating their emissions. Now, when we get to the bill that we wrote, we followed the same kind of basic prescription, which is you authorize the agency to figure it out. We're not trying to write every detail, every regulatory scheme, but it basically requires the agency to make it happen. In other words, the legislature, if they pass this, would be basically mandating that the Environmental Quality Commission, through their administrative and legal rights, construct the law to make it happen, and then the Department of Environmental Quality is the administrative body. The regulatory, we actually wrote some regulatory language into our draft, and the Legislative Council, it's one of 3 or 4 things that bothered us that they dropped out. We identified about 24 changes that they made in what we had drafted. 3 of them were substantive. We've already put in amendments to get 2 of them back in. And regulatory, we asked for a negotiation or a conversation with the Legislative Council because they may have we haven't had that conversation yet. The intent absolutely is to have regulatory and forceful regulatory power to make it happen.
On the bill that you're using to mimic California, where does the income or what comes out of that for the auctions go?
It is not specified again. What we're really doing is requiring us to meet the targets and give the agency the responsibility to make that happen. And if they pick the wrong target and they get out to the first renewal stage at 5 years and they're off target, then they're required by law, by legislative dictate to, so I can tell you in California, if that's what you want me to do, if you want to use that model, we expect the way that it's written, because it requires the state of Oregon to look at other jurisdictions for good insights. And because California specifically wrote their law to broaden, to invite entities to come into it, we certainly would expect, and from conversations that I've had with people in the Department of Environmental Quality, they would expect that to be the case. There will be hearings with the EQC, the Environmental Quality Commission. Those are the places where we would be advocating for that, and they would be the ones to decide that. If it turns out that California's approaches are not hewing the line to achieve the objectives, we may be needing to follow some other particular strategy as well. So we elected not to be very specific about that, because that's better to be left to the agencies, because they need to develop it and have some degree of jurisdictional adaptability to the circumstances. I could talk about how California does it though, but maybe not here.
My question is about greenhouse gas emissions and how how your bill or the other bills figure that out. Is that a standard, or is there room for wiggle room on the fugitive emissions?
I would characterize as the Department of Environmental Quality, and one of the reasons we elected to go in that direction rather than say the Department of Energy. The Department of Environmental Quality is probably a national leader in the analysis of carbon emissions. There's a fellow there by the name of David Holloway. He's a great speaker, but he works on this all the time. He has a team of individuals. They've been at the cutting edge. They are working on carbon emissions, which they calculate based upon consumption-based rather than production-based. That's brought about a policy in the state of Oregon that when we allocate carbon emissions and we're buying some of our electricity from coal plants in Wyoming, those carbon emissions come to us rather than allocated to Wyoming. That's an example. Oregon was the first state in the nation, and still one of the very few states which uses consumption-based rather than production-based accounting. And so the way they include carbon allocations in Oregon, say for example, products from China get allocated to us rather than to the Chinese. And that's a very significant component of our emissions, is products that we buy from overseas.
Sorry, we're going to have to wrap this up. Tom's not going to run off. So if you have questions for Tom or Cheryl afterwards, I'd be more than interested in allowing you to do that. We do have to do a couple of things, but what I want you to do, please, this isn't determining SOCAN's position. This is helping us think about where your preferences lie. Please mark your ballots from 5 to 1, and if you think a couple of them are about the same, just give them the same number, then skip a number as you're going down. Just so we have a sort of sense of what those of you who were here think as a result of the outcome. What we're going to be doing is having a government group meeting a week from tonight, and I would encourage members of the government group and the ad hoc Fee on Carbon group to join us to discuss what we think the SOCAN position should be. And I'm going to be sending a note out reminding everybody of that. It's at 4 o'clock at the Talent Phoenix Firehouse, which is on 99. Oh, it's on the list Kathy's going to mention. Okay, so, important. Take action on these issues. Please don't just lie back and let it roll over you and roll over the rest of the planet. If you go to the SOCAN website and click Act Now, you will find a label, Political Action. Select State Political Action, and you'll see a list of local and House Energy and Environment Committee representatives. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is send a note to all of them, encouraging them to support legislation that addresses this issue. If you are interested in a summary of legislative items, just click on the political action update line on that page and you'll get a link to the OLIS website that Tom was mentioning to you, where you can get all of the bills that we've been talking about. Also contact your local representatives to urge them to support these issues, and all of the representatives, local representatives, are listed on that page as well, so you can reach them that way. Wrong button. I particularly mentioned members of the House Energy and Environment Committee. The important thing is your contact with those representatives really, really counts. The hearing is on April the 14th. If you are able to go to Salem on April the 14th, that would be great. It's good both to have numbers in the audience, and also there's going to be some opportunity for public comment. Important point, individual action is a necessary but insufficient response. It's incredibly important that we all do everything we can to reduce our energy, our fossil fuel consumption. But that's not going to turn the tide. We have to have political action at the state, federal, and international level to really address this. And I keep making this point every time I talk about this whole issue. It's a matter of intergenerational justice. If we care about the livability of the planet for future generations, we absolutely have to do something about it. I'm going to pass on to Kathy and get a
Can I
slideshow.
just say one thing about all this, and I should have said this. If you're just Googling a bill on the web, you can do that. You can say Oregon, HB, whatever the bill number is, but be sure and put in the year if you do that. And on all lists, make sure you have the right year for the bill you're looking for. Otherwise, you're going to find the bill is something like having to do with tobacco or something. So you're going to say, oh, what's going on here? Okay.
Alan, quick question on the ballot. What's the difference between with and without HJM resolution?
Those House Joint Memorial Resolutions were the ones that deal with the constitutional issues. That's, if you remember when David was talking, one of
That stands for House Joint Resolution, and that means that it's intended, in order for it to be referred, it has to go, any bill has to